The Biden administration announces January 4th deadline for its employer vaccine mandate. Several Republican governors and attorneys general have vowed to fight the new rule in court. And 19 states are suing the Biden administration over the mandates. And what about religious exemption? We sat down with Jay Richards, William E. Simon Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, to hear his thoughts. Tune into Deep Dive as we explore these topics and more. Hello and welcome back. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meier. As you can see, we are back in the studio, but we do still have some great interviews from the National Conservatism Conference. We sat down with Jay Richards, William E. Simon Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, to hear his thoughts on religious exemptions amid the vaccine mandates. But before we get into that, some updates. The Biden administration has an official deadline for workers who fall under its new vaccination mandate. On Thursday, the White House announced certain healthcare workers, federal contractors, and employees at larger businesses must comply with its new vaccine rules by January 4th. That means some 84 million employees and 17 million healthcare workers have 2 months to become fully vaccinated. Officials say the federal mandate preempts any state or local laws. OSHA and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services will implement the rules. The OSHA rule requires employers with 100 or more employees to put vaccine requirements in place for all staff, but it could be expanded to include smaller businesses. In the 490-page document, the agency notes OSHA is seeking public comments on that aspect, and it may be ultimately expanded to include smaller businesses. OSHA is also asking employers for input, stating, OSHA seeks information about the ability of employers with fewer than 100 employees to implement COVID-19 vaccination and/or testing programs. Violations could include fines of up to nearly $14,000 for each infraction, with an increased fine if the violation is found to be, quote, willful. The rule takes effect immediately upon publication. It's set to publish on Friday. Business groups have called for the administration to delay the deadline or be more flexible. The new rule does allow for employees to remain unvaccinated, but the worker must provide a verified negative test to their employer on at least a weekly basis and must wear face masks in the workplace. Healthcare workers do not have the testing option, but religious and medical exemptions can be accommodated. The new rule already seeing pushback. Several Republican governors and attorneys general have vowed to fight the new rule in court. House Education and Labor Committee Republican leader Virginia Foxx said on Thursday that Republican lawmakers on her committee will, quote, introduce immediately a Congressional Review Act resolution to nullify OSHA's emergency rule when it is received by Congress. And a group of Republican senators sent a letter to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on Wednesday, signaling their intention to block funding for the vaccine mandate. Senator Roger Marshall said in the letter, "We will oppose all efforts to implement and enforce it with every tool at our disposal, including our votes on spending measures considered by the Senate." Adding, "To be sure, we agree that countless Americans have benefited from the protection offered by the COVID-19 vaccines. Nevertheless, the decision whether to be vaccinated against COVID-19 is a highly personal one that should never be forced upon individuals by the federal government." So far, more than a dozen GOP-led states have sued the administration over a related but separate mandate that federal contractors and workers get the vaccine. As of Friday, 19 states filed federal lawsuits against the vaccine mandates. Texas sued individually in a federal court in Galveston. The lawsuit accuses the Biden administration of, quote, using subterfuge to accomplish what they cannot achieve directly, universal compliance with their vaccine mandates, regardless of individual preferences, healthcare needs, or religious beliefs. Another lawsuit filed in a federal district court in Missouri involves Alaska, Arkansas, Iowa, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, New Hampshire, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. The suit calls the administration's mandate unconstitutional, unlawful, and unwise. And another lawsuit filed in a federal district court in Georgia involves Georgia, Alabama, Idaho, Kansas, South Carolina, Utah, and West Virginia. A release from Georgia Governor Brian Kemp's office says the complaint, in part, explains how the Biden administration's mandate has placed Georgia state agencies and officials in an untenable position. Kemp went on to say in a statement, in addition to being an unlawful and unconstitutional overreach, this vaccine mandate on federal contractors will only further divide Americans and hamstring our economy. These come a day after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announced he sued the administration over the same vaccine mandate. All 19 states argue that the mandate violates federal procurement law and is an overreach of federal power. The states also argue that Biden's vaccine mandate violates the 10th Amendment that separates the power between federal and state governments, uses federal spending to coerce the states, which is unconstitutional, and did not properly allow for 60 days of public comment. And now questions around whether or not the Supreme Court will weigh in and whether or not religious exemption will hold up in court. We sat down with Jay Richards, William E. Simon Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation at the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando, Florida, to hear his thoughts. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Oh, good to be with you. Thanks.
So recently, it seems like all in the news headlines is these vaccine mandates. And so lately, it seems like the Supreme Court might weigh in. So what's your take on what that will look like?
Well, so there have been several opportunities so far for the Supreme Court to weigh in. And so far, they have actually just really declined to do that. I think they're expecting these things to go through the courts.
So right now, two of the hardest hit states, in this
Yes.
sense, seems to be New York and Maine. And in New York, we're seeing, say, the fire department, sanitation, a lot of different sectors losing people and
Right.
now struggling over this issue. So how far do you think this can go before it kind of explodes?
Well, honestly, I think what we're seeing is that up until now, I think the president was honestly relying on people to comply. It's astonishing, though, when you can see hundreds or even thousands of healthcare workers and medical providers, firefighters who decide that, they would honestly rather lose their jobs or retire than to be coerced into taking the vaccine. And so I think he was honestly hoping that everyone would just comply with this. But of course, if we have thousands of people, healthcare providers, that we end up with shortages of healthcare providers precisely when we need it. I think, if anything, as my friend Wesley Smith said, this is an exploding cigar. It might look like it made sense at the beginning, but it could very well do the opposite. It could make people more skeptical of a vaccine than they would have been otherwise.
And so you brought up the legality earlier, and a lot of people who are suing these states in courts are saying their First Amendment rights are being
Yes.
infringed upon. So what's your take on that?
Well, that's the dilemma. And so many of the people that object to the vaccine do so for sincerely held religious reasons. So at least in the United States, all the vaccines that are available have either been tested on embryonic stem cells or actually developed using that. And so many people who are opposed to abortion then say, look, I don't want to participate, I don't want to appropriate the work of abortion. Maybe if my life were at risk or something like that and I had to do it, I would. But, many people say if they've had COVID, they're not really at risk, and so they don't want to participate in that. So they have a real religious objection to it. And so that's why I honestly think long term, they're going to have a very strong case if they are coerced to that. But of course, it takes a long time for these things to work their way through the courts. And so it's cold comfort if you lose your job tomorrow and you win in the Supreme Court 5 years from now, it's still going to have a devastating effect.
So why do you think there is such a big pushback? And say, because from the federal level, they're saying just everyone comply, but
Yes.
there is such a big pushback. So why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of it is honestly the coercion. I think, especially from the beginning. So many things that have happened from public health authorities. We all remember in 2020, one day no one was supposed to wear a mask. The next day it was absolutely mandatory. Right? Suddenly we're told we can't be in school. Suddenly we can't gather unless we have a political protest, and then yet it's okay. We're told that it didn't leak from a lab, and now we're told, well, maybe it did. And so public health authorities themselves have lost so much credibility. And so then now when we're told we absolutely have to have a vaccine, and we're also told, frankly, that the coronavirus is more deadly than it turns out to be. I think there's a lot of distrust. And given a context of distrust, then for the government to essentially say, look, you have to get this thing. I just think it makes sense, especially for Americans who we're attached to our liberties. And so I'm not a bit surprised that so many people have resisted this at this point.
And so you mentioned how it'd be like cold comfort for people who lose their jobs to then win, 5 years from now.
Yes.
So, but is there anything people can do now to kind of stem this tide?
Well, I think the main thing that people should do is with their individual employers. And so most employers still recognize medical exemptions and religious exemptions. And so if someone has either medical reason, right, so maybe you've had COVID and you don't really have any reason to have to get the vaccine, or you have a sincere religious objection, ask for an exemption from your employer. And so many employers are doing that. I hear from people all the time that are doing that. And so at the moment, that's the most likely source of relief. But of course, what we're hearing, especially in places like New York and Maine, is that employers are refusing to do it. And so at the moment, it's going to depend upon the individual benevolence of individual employers.
Because like in New York, for example, I think a federal judge just dismissed the case,
Yes.
saying because of healthcare workers,
Yes.
most were Catholic, and they were suing on those grounds. And the judge said it didn't work because rubella also used the same technology,
Right.
like stem cells and stuff, and there was no outrage over that, and threw it away because of political reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like there's a lot of gray area around the legality.
Yes.
So how can that be cleared up? Can it be cleared up?
It can be cleared up, and it will be cleared up long term. It's first of all, it's strange for a judge to decide this, what is essentially a moral and religious question. It's really not up to a judge to decide whether someone's religious objection is sincere. And the truth of the matter is, there are lots of Catholics, in particular, that object to the rubella, the MMR vaccine, on the same ground. So it's really quite disingenuous. But I do think there's very strong legal precedent for religious exemption protection. It's just that the courts are it's a slow mechanism, and if the Supreme Court doesn't want to sort of preempt that process, then it could be a year or 2 years. And so the sort of on-the-ground effects, they're going to be what they are, even if ultimately there is legal relief.
Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
That was Jay Richards, William E. Simon Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And now before we end, a racehorse has captured the hearts of Japanese citizens with its amusing, tongue-twisting name. Check out this video to see how its name makes commenting on the race a tough task.
Thanks, Grandpa, back there with some momo. Now moving forward, smart, else up. Smart Elsa, star a bouquet, and here comes Sumomo, coming down to the wire, half a furlong left to go. Star a bouquet, Sumomo, coming across the line, Sumomo in for the victory.
After winning the third race on Monday, this 3-year-old filly became a star at a Tokyo racecourse. But her 9-syllable name has been a source of terror for racing commentators. The name is based on a Japanese tongue twister that means plums and peaches are both peaches. But the phrase and the horse's name are now gaining fame online, leaving Twitter users laughing and confused at the same time. Well, what do you think? Let me know below. Thanks for tuning into Deep Dive. I'm Tiffany Meier, and see you soon.